Picture this. A room full of missionaries, educated men with theological degrees and years of field experience, gathered in a dim hall in the hills of northern India. They have been praying for 3 weeks, fasting, pleading. Some of them have crossed oceans for this moment, have given up comfortable lives in England and America to carry the gospel into the mountains. And yet the room is dry, desperate but dry. Then a young man walks in. He is not ordained. He has no seminary degree. He owns almost nothing. A thin wool robe, a pair of worn sandals, and a Bible so read through the spine has cracked 3 times and been rewrapped in cloth. He sits down quietly in the corner. He does not announce himself. He barely speaks. And then he begins to pray, and the room changes. God was preparing this vessel for a very long time, and the preparation looked nothing like what anyone expected. Kartar Singh was born in 1881 in Rampur, a village in the Punjab region of northern India, into a Sikh family of considerable standing. His father was a landowner, respected in the community, the kind of man whose word settled disputes, and whose house always had food on the table. His mother was the quiet force behind everything. She rose before dawn. She prayed in whispers. She told her youngest son stories about the saints of every tradition, with the kind of reverence that made a child understand that the holy was not far away. It was right here, in this room, in this body, in this breath. Kartar was her treasure. She called him that openly, without embarrassment. "You are my treasure." And he believed her, not because he was proud, but because she said it the way people say true things, simply, without decoration. She died when he was 9 years old. Nobody prepares you for that. Nobody can. One day the person who is the center of your universe is there, and then she is not. And the world continues on as if something enormous has not just collapsed. Kartar sat at her grave for a long time after the funeral. He did not cry right away. He just sat there, the way a person sits when they cannot yet understand the shape of what has happened to them. In the weeks that followed, something shifted in him, not toward despair, though despair came, and it stayed a long while, but toward hunger. A hunger he could not name. He began to read everything his mother had read. He sat with the Granth Sahib for hours. He asked questions his father did not know how to answer. He wandered into the edges of their property at night and looked at the sky and asked the sky things. He was 9 years old and already searching for something he had lost without knowing he had it. His father remarried within 2 years. The new household was not cruel, but it was different. Colder, more formal. The kind of home where you knew exactly where you stood, which was useful, but where no one called you their treasure, which was not. Kartar learned to make himself smaller. He learned to be quiet. He read more. He wandered more. He prayed in ways that he had no name for, speaking to a God he had not yet identified, out of a need so raw and specific that formal religion felt, at that age, too broad to hold it. When he was 15, a small mission school opened in a nearby town. His father sent him there not out of spiritual interest, but out of practical calculation. English was the language of advancement, and the mission schools taught it well. Kartar went and sat in the back of a classroom and tried to learn English declensions, and instead found himself listening, almost against his will, to the stories a Scottish missionary named Macaulay told between grammar lessons. Stories about a carpenter who touched lepers, who crossed to the other side of the lake to reach one demon-possessed man who lived among the tombs because everyone else had crossed to avoid him, who looked at a woman caught in adultery, in a circle of men holding stones, and bent down and wrote something in the dust. Kartar did not convert at 15. He left the mission school after 1 term and went home and said nothing about what he had heard. But something had gotten in, like a splinter under the skin, invisible, but you know it is there. The breaking point came 2 years later. He was 17. The hunger had not gone away. It had gotten worse, the way a wound gets worse when you stop paying attention to it. He was reading everything, trying everything, sitting with religious teachers of every tradition who passed through the region. None of it landed. None of it reached the specific empty place inside him. He went 3 days without eating and spent the nights in prayer and felt, at the end of those 3 days, more hollow than when he started. On the morning of the 3rd day, still in the dark before dawn, he knelt on the floor of his room and said, and this is the only word for what he said, "If you are real, show me. If there is truth, I need to find it today, because I cannot keep searching like this. He was not speaking to anyone in particular, or perhaps he was speaking to everyone at once. What happened next, Kartar would describe for the rest of his life with the same careful, unembellished language. A light filled the room, not the lamp. The lamp was cold, a light that had no source he could identify. And in that light, a presence. Not frightening, the opposite of frightening. The most natural thing he had ever experienced, as if this was the thing the room had been waiting to contain all along. He did not hear an audible voice. He felt a knowing settle into him like water finding its level. He knew who the presence was, and he knew, with a certainty he would never again question, that this was the one he had been looking for since he was 9 years old, sitting at his mother's grave. He was 17 years old, and everything changed. His father did not take it well. This is an understatement. His father, a man of dignity and standing in a Sikh community, had a son who was now speaking openly about following Jesus. Not in the private, personal way that might be overlooked, but with the kind of full-body conviction that made concealment impossible. Kartar did not perform his faith. He simply could not hide it. It had gotten into his face. His father tried reasoning first, then pleading, then anger. Then he brought in community elders. Then he tried to arrange a marriage quickly to a girl from a good family, calculating that domesticity might extinguish this fire before it spread further. Kartar was respectful through all of it. He was never cruel to his father, but he did not waver. The final confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Kartar had been gone overnight, praying in the fields. He came home at dawn and his father met him at the gate. The whole household was behind him. Neighbors had gathered. An uncle had come from 2 towns over. Kartar's father stood there and said, in a voice that was perfectly controlled, which made it worse than shouting, "If you will not turn from this, you are no longer my son." Kartar looked at his father for a long moment. He loved his father. "That was not in question," he said. "I will always be your son. I cannot be otherwise. But I cannot deny what I have seen." He was turned away from the gate. He walked out of the village with nothing but his robe and his worn Bible. He was 18 years old. For the next several years, Kartar wandered. This is not a metaphor. He literally walked through the Punjab plains, into the foothills, eventually into the mountains of the Himalayas. He walked the way the early Christian monks walked, not running away from something but toward something, following the pull of a presence he could now locate and lean into. He ate when people fed him. He slept in fields, in doorways, in monasteries whose monks were not always glad to have him, but let him stay because he was clearly harmless and clearly something else at the same time. He carried no money. He raised no support. He wrote no newsletters describing his progress. He had no strategy. He had a conviction that if he went where God sent him and said what God gave him to say, it would be enough, and he discovered day by day, village by village, that it was. He prayed for a blind man in a village in Himachal Pradesh, and the man's vision returned. Kartar moved on quickly, uncomfortably, not wanting the attention. He sat with a dying woman in the mountains above Simla and held her hand for 2 days, and on the 2nd day something lifted in her face, and she died in a peace that her family said they had never seen in her before. In a Tibetan village where he was not welcomed, a child with fever was healed during the night after Kartar prayed, and by morning the village headman was asking him questions. He did not trumpet these things. This is important to understand. He did not build a ministry around them or use them to establish credibility. He would describe them later, in letters, almost reluctantly, the way you mention a detail that seems relevant but that you are embarrassed to raise because it sounds too large. He wrote to a friend, "I do not want to talk about what God does. I only want to talk about who God is. What he does follows from that. Talking about it in the other direction feels like showing someone photographs of a person and expecting them to fall in love." The mountains nearly killed him, more than once. He was caught in a snowstorm in the passes above 4,000 meters and survived 3 nights in a ditch, covering himself with his robe, praying without ceasing because it was the only thing generating any heat inside him. He came out of that storm frostbitten and thin, and immediately walked to the next village and began telling people what he had seen on the mountain. He was not trying to be heroic. He did not have a romanticism about suffering. He once wrote, with characteristic directness, I do not enjoy the cold. I do not enjoy hunger. But I enjoy being where God sends me, and this is where He sent me. So here I am. The years in the mountains were years of formation that no seminary could have provided. He learned patience in the way you only learn it when there is nothing to rush toward. He learned silence, real silence, not the absence of words, but the presence of listening, in the monasteries where he occasionally wintered. He learned to read people, to sit with a person until he could feel what they were not saying, and then to speak to exactly that thing. Missionaries who later traveled with him for a season would describe it as uncanny. Kartar would sit with a stranger for 20 minutes, and then quietly say something that caused the stranger to look up as if caught, as if known. He never explained how he did it. He would have laughed at the question. He would have said, "I just pay attention," and prayed, and then said what came. By the time Kartar was in his early 30s, word of him had spread in ways entirely outside his control. He was not trying to build a reputation. Reputation found him the way light finds a window, not because the window is doing anything, but because that is simply what windows do. Missionaries began seeking him out. Churches invited him to speak. He came when he felt directed to come and declined, gently, when he did not. And this pattern frustrated people who wanted to schedule him and moved people who encountered him, because there was something clarifying about meeting a man who genuinely did not care whether you considered his ministry a success. He was invited to Europe in 1920. He went to England, to Switzerland, to Germany, to Sweden. He wore his yellow robe everywhere. He sat in grand old churches and in small fellowship halls and spoke, through translators in his careful, unhurried English, about what it was like to walk with God in the mountains, about his mother, about the morning at 17, about the cost of obedience and the strange mathematics of it, how the more you gave away, the more you seemed to have. Audiences wept. Not because he was dramatic, he was the opposite of dramatic. They wept because there was nothing between him and what he was saying. No performance, no professional religious scaffolding, no effort to impress. He stood there and told you what was true, and it went in like something cold and clear, and you found yourself thinking about things you had been avoiding for years. In Sweden, an elderly professor who had spent 40 years in academic theology attended one of Kartar's meetings. After the meeting, the professor sat for a long time without speaking. Then he said to a colleague beside him, "I know more about this subject than that man does, and yet he knows it in a way I do not." That was the thing about Kartar. He had not studied the knowledge, he had lived it, and you could tell. He returned to India. He always returned to India, to the mountains, to the walking. Europe offered him comfort and platform and connection, and he received these things with gratitude and without hunger, the way you receive a gift you appreciate, but did not need. Home was the hills. Home was the thin air, and the cold, and the narrow paths, and the villages where people had never heard any of this, and were hearing it for the first time. He crossed into Tibet multiple times. This was genuinely dangerous. Tibet in the early 1920s was not hospitable to Christian missionaries. There had been expulsions, there had been imprisonments. There were stories of men who went in and did not come out. Kartar went anyway. He went not with a strategy, or a vision for church planting, or a partnership with a mission organization. He went because when he prayed about it, the direction was clear, and he had learned, over many years of testing, that when the direction was clear, you went. On one of these journeys into Tibet, he was arrested. He was taken to a lama who had authority in the region, a man of immense seriousness, who had heard about this Indian wanderer in a yellow robe who was disturbing the spiritual order of the villages. The lama questioned him for several hours. Kartar answered every question directly, without hedging, without diplomacy, with the calm of someone who does not fear the outcome of the conversation, because they have already handed the outcome over. The lama did not let him go. He was thrown into a pit, a dry well, essentially, into which the bodies of condemned men were thrown to die over days amid the decay of those who had died before them. The smell was unimaginable. The darkness was complete. Kartar prayed. He said later that he prayed with more clarity in that pit than he had prayed anywhere else, because there was nothing to distract him and nothing to lose. On the third night, the cover of the pit was lifted. He climbed out. He never knew who lifted it. He walked out of the city while it was still dark and continued on the path. He wrote about this later without drama, almost as a footnote. What he lingered on was not the deliverance, but what he experienced in the darkness before it. A nearness, he called it. The sense that the presence he had first encountered at 17 was there in the pit with him, not making the pit less bad, but making it possible to be in the pit without being destroyed by it. This, he said, was the gift, not rescue. Presence. He was in his 40s by now, and the years of walking, of altitude, of cold, of fasting, had done what such years do to a body. He was thin in the way that worried people who saw him. He had a persistent cough that would not clear. People urged him to rest. He listened politely and did not rest. He was constitutionally incapable of resting as long as there were paths and villages, and people who had not yet heard what he had spent his life carrying. In 1929, he prepared for another journey into the Tibetan highlands. He told the small community of friends around him that he planned to go in late spring, when the passes opened. He organized his few belongings. He wrote letters, careful, warm, unhurried letters, to friends in India and England and Sweden. He wrote to the Scottish missionary Macaulay, now elderly, who had first told him stories in a classroom 30 years before. "You changed the direction of my life without knowing it. I think God uses people that way often. You plant something and you walk away, and 20 years later it is a tree, and you don't even remember the planting." He left in April of 1929. He did not come back. No one knows precisely what happened. His last confirmed sighting was at a village in the high passes, where he stopped for a night and prayed with a family and moved on in the morning. After that, nothing. No body was ever found. No word came back. He was 47 years old. In the years and decades that followed, people tried to account for Kartar Singh with the tools they had available. The frameworks of ministry success, of measurable impact, of institutional legacy. And by most of those measures, the accounting was difficult. He planted no churches. He founded no organization. He left no system, no methodology, no reproducible model. He raised no funding and reported no numbers and built no platform. What he left was this: a trail of people across 2 continents in 30 years who encountered him and were changed. A blind man in a village who could see. A dying woman who died in peace. A Swedish professor who spent the rest of his career slightly undone by the distance between what he knew and what a man in a yellow robe knew. A Tibetan family who to this day, generations later, still speak of the Indian wanderer who prayed in their house one night in 1929 and left before morning. He left a handful of letters, carefully preserved by those who received them. He left the memory of a man who was entirely present wherever he was, who seemed to carry no weight from the past and no anxiety about the future, who lived with the uncanny lightness of someone who had given everything away and discovered that this was, counterintuitively, how you traveled farthest. He left the example of a life that did not look like success by any ordinary measure, and yet, whenever you looked at the people he had touched, you could not help feeling that something had happened through him that was larger than any institution, larger than any platform, larger than any number. And he left a question, which is perhaps the most enduring thing anyone leaves behind. He left the question that his whole life asked, in every mountain pass, and every cold village, and every dark pit, and every lit room. What would it look like to want nothing for yourself, to hold nothing back, to go wherever you are sent, say whatever you are given, and leave the outcomes entirely to God? Kartar Singh did not preach that question. He did not explain it or defend it or build a conference around it. He simply lived it, for 30 years in the hills and the cold and the silence. And somewhere out there, in a high pass in Tibet, he kept walking until he disappeared into whatever comes next. We don't know exactly where he went. But those who knew him always said the same thing when people asked how they felt about the fact that he never came back. They said, he was never keeping himself for us. He was always on his way somewhere. This was just the final leg of the same journey he had been on since he was 17 years old. When he knelt on a floor before dawn and said, "If you are real, show me," he was shown. And then he spent every remaining day of his life showing others. That is the price. The hidden life, the wandering path, the choosing of presence over platform, of obedience over comfort, of a borrowed wool robe over the security of belonging somewhere safe. Kartar Singh paid it without complaint. The question is not whether someone like him could exist today. The question is whether you and I are willing to ask the same thing he asked at 17, in the dark, before dawn, and then go wherever the answer leads.